and welcome back. We're going to continue where we left off, talking about changes from the medieval period to the Renaissance in terms of studies and education, and then we'll move into how it changed people's life in general. If you recall from lesson 1 of our last unit, the main method of education in the medieval period was called scholasticism. It's where we get the word school from and scholar. And it did lay a foundation of how to do research and education, but it had its limits too. Again, if you remember in scholasticism, it focused on building on established truth. So in the scholastic method, there'd be this yes or no question, and you find everything you could in terms of why the answer is yes or why it's no. But it's the professor who has the last word, because he is an example of established truth with his doctorate degree. And even the sources you use will be things like the Church Fathers or Aristotle. Again, established truth that people trusted they had it right. But in the in the Renaissance, a new type of learning emerges called humanism, or the liberal arts. Some of you may have heard the term humanism used in a bad way, like as if people who are humanists don't believe in God. But in the Renaissance, it doesn't have that connotation. Again, just as we saw in art, people were focused on the humanity of art, the humanity of people in the Bible. They weren't trying to ignore God. They were just focusing on something the Middle Ages had neglected, as it spiritualized things with so much symbolism. And the term liberal arts as the idea of liberty, liberal meaning being free, liberty to rethink and come up with your own ideas. And so perhaps some of you, as you're thinking about colleges, are looking at liberal arts colleges. These are colleges indebted to this liberal arts system that emerged during the Renaissance. And how does humanism, Renaissance humanism and liberal arts work? Well, it works on going back to the sources and learning the necessary skills to come up with your own answers. So rather than understand the Bible based on what someone else says, you can go back and read it in Greek and read it in Hebrew and analyze the poetry and the rhetoric and come up with your own ideas about what you think the Bible's saying. Again, I'll say that again as I write down the notes. So it focuses on discovering, on learning history, poetry, languages, sorry, my stylus is not working very well. Languages and rhetoric, so that you may form your own opinions. In other words, think for yourself. Even the idea of having a language requirement for college comes from this time, in a sense, in that it was now going, not rather than just have your own language and also learn Latin, you would now learn other languages so that you can explore their ideas and culture and formulate your own ideas into how life connects. Speaking of life, let's look now at how things changed in terms of social status, identity, social identity, and opportunities. In the medieval period, except for merchants and crusaders, you pretty much spent your entire life in the castle if you were the super rich, or the village if you were like most people. But in the Renaissance, you start having people travel more and discover or explore new lands. These lands weren't really new. They were Native Americans or Africans or Indians or other people living on them, islanders. But it was during this time that you have Christopher Columbus and other explorers travel far and wide and discover, I put in quotes again, it's not really discovering, but they discover these new lands, like how big Africa was. People had known about North Africa because it was close to Europe, but South Africa and other parts of Africa were less familiar to Europeans. Africa, different Australia later on, the islands, and especially then the Americas were the big find, as no one except perhaps Leif Erikson and the Vikings had known that there was this huge continent dividing Asia and Europe if you travel by water. And these traveling affected many aspects of the culture. In the Middle Ages, a motto might have been, you are to fulfill the duties God put before you. In other words, if you're a peasant, you're to be the best peasant you can be for the glory of God. If you're a noble, you're to be the best noble you can be for the glory of God. If you're a merchant, be the best merchant for God's glory. But in the Renaissance, again, they're not getting rid of God, but there's a sense in which God provides opportunities. You have perhaps the beginning of what's the American dream, where you can start somewhere in life but change your course through your hard work. And so your duty is to appreciate and explore all the wonderful world that God made. Be well-rounded. And you can think of Leonardo da Vinci. He was an artist, a scientist, a mathematician, an inventor. He learned all that he could, and he did amazing work that revolutionized people's learning and opportunities. And his art still amazes people and sells for hundreds of millions of dollars. And so this idea that you could explore different things, that you could make the most of opportunities, grew. And so while in the Middle Ages, most people just farmed land, and so work followed the seasons. In the Renaissance, as more people lived in cities, and with a money economy brought on by the plague, it became more common to work year-round. So you can say, when you graduate high school or college and say goodbye to your summer vacations, you can thank the changes that started in the Renaissance. Again, in the Middle Ages, most people were either peasants or the nobility. There was a very small little class, and again, very, very few people were in nobility. But in the Renaissance, it becomes more common to have this wealthy non-nobility, the middle class, that probably most of you are familiar with. You're not super rich, but you're not poor, and you have different opportunities. You may not have everything at your fingertips, but you have opportunities to learn and do something with your life because your family has some education and money to provide you. This sometimes caused problems as they butted heads with the nobility, these newer rich people. I know in English class you've been reading The Great Gatsby and seeing some of this conflict between old money and new money. And this middle class also became very popular with the peasants and the lower classes as it inspired them to have opportunities in the future. So, where does this all lead to? In the Middle Ages, people's identity was largely based on their participation in the Catholic Church and their allegiance to the Pope. And then secondly, to their local community, as we talked about. But by the time we get to the Renaissance, things have changed. While, again, the God and the church is important, there is much more of a sense of a national identity, an allegiance to the king or to some other national authority like Parliament. And so while before, if your local leader said something, and especially if the Pope said something, you would listen. Now we're going to see a more sense of an English identity that will challenge the Pope, or a German identity that will challenge the Pope and even the Emperor. Although that's a little more complicated because Germany is part of a larger empire in the Holy Roman Empire. But we're going to see that things are changing, and this is why when John Wycliffe and John Huss, they present problems with the church and want to bring change, the church is able to condemn them and burn them. Wycliffe was already dead, but still burned. But we're going to see when these same types of challenges come up now, people are willing to listen to new voices and new ideas, and the church will not be able to squelch and oppress its dissenters this time. We're going to pick up on the church more in our next lesson for 5b.